What's up, guys? Welcome to this new thought of the day kind or style video. By popular request, John and Paul, or Raul, sorry, you guys were interested in using the Moxy on a daily basis. So I'm going to try and expand a little bit on that topic. First and foremost, I'd like to say that I haven't spent enough time collecting daily data and then analyzing it to have a full picture to give on this, but I'll just try my best with what I've seen so far. As you've probably seen from my last video, I use the Moxys quite frequently every time I do any type of testing, so VO2 max type tests. Like I said in the other video, I usually do longer steps because I want to see a steady state or at least a balance between delivery and utilization. And then I can have on my 4-minute steps, the last 2 minutes are usually telling me what direction that curve is going, or that line is going. And that's interesting information. So I think there's something there, definitely with the intensity domains. Now, there's multiple things that come as additional factors to consider, and maybe additional difficulties that this adds to the picture. The first one being that not every, even for a given muscle group, and from the data that I've been able to collect until now, not every athlete responds the same, right? So, for example, the two profiles that seem to emerge, and I'll take a vastus lateralis on a cyclist, for example, as the most basic example, or probably the muscle group that's used the most for the Moxy so far, that has been used the most. So what I see is usually two different profiles of curves that emerge from a test. So if I start the test low enough and we build up all the way to volitional failure, what I'll see is two different presentations, and we haven't found names for those yet, but Jem Arnold, who's doing his PhD right now in Vancouver with the Moxy, offered a description of a parabolic profile and a linear profile, which makes sense to me, so we'll kind of run with that until we have a better explanation. But essentially what we'll see with some people is that in the moderate intensity domain, they're going to have a positive slope. So the oximetry trend is going up. In the heavy intensity domain, they're going to have a flat, kind of a stable SMO2. And then in the severe intensity domain, they're going to have a negative slope. And so it's going downwards. So it goes up, flat, down. Okay, that's the parabolic. And then what you'll see then with a linear profile, which is in general more highly trained people. Most males present like this. I'd say that most females present in the parabolic, and people that are less trained are also in the parabolic kind of profile. But the males usually, the linear profile usually goes flat, down, flat. So in the moderate intensity domain, you have kind of a zero slope, or you're approaching zero slope. And when you break zero and you go into negative, that's when you transition into heavy. And then once you're getting into severe, then it flattens out again at the bottom. So for the parabolic, you might see 40 to maybe 50 to 70% SMO2 in the moderate intensity domain. And then 70 or 80 down to maybe 70, 60, but it's still flat, but over 2 or 3 steps, the absolute value might go down. And then in the severe, you might go down only to 50, or some people go all the way down to 30 or 20. And then if you have a linear profile, usually you'll see starting values in the moderate intensity domain around between 50 and 70. And then you might have a negative slope that takes you down to 20 or even sub 20, and then you're going to have a flat line between 10 and 20%. So that's usually the two main presentations that we see. So if we talk about using Moxy on a daily basis to assess intensity distribution. I think the difficulty currently is that there are no advanced real-time analytics tools that you can use with Moxy that maybe calculate an average slope over the last minute or two, or I'd have to actually think about how to set that up ideally, but I obviously do all my analysis after the effort, because as we know, and that's, I'm going to probably do a few parallels with lactate values here in that video. But as we know, physiology is messy, and it's not easy to measure, or it's maybe not easy to look at data in real time because there's so much variation. Even if you just try to stay super locked in on your watts and your RPMs on a bike, for example, you're still going to see some fluctuations, and they're usually going to be more important fluctuations that you might see on a heart rate trend. So that's a difficulty, I think, is how to get through the noise, right? I think it's fairly easy to calculate slopes and look at the overall trend of the data after a session, but in real time is still pretty challenging. You can do it, I believe, but it's still pretty challenging. Then you have the added component as well that you might see a difference between left and right. I always see a difference between my left and my right side. And interestingly enough, when I sent my testing data to Andrew Feldman, who co-developed the Moxy and who's working on a critical oxygenation profile right now, with looking at oximetry slopes essentially, and looking at that zero slope and what it intersects with. Interestingly enough, I sent him my data, and my zero slope, I have a linear profile, and you can imagine that zero slope would be equivalent to threshold 1 in someone who's got a linear profile, but then zero slope, so transition from 0 to negative slope, would be the equivalent of the second threshold for someone who's got a parabolic profile. So already there's two different presentations that you have to consider. Interestingly enough, Andrew sent me my data and said, well, your zero slope on your left leg is at 160 watts, and your zero slope on your right leg is at 180 watts. I believe those were the numbers. My first lactate threshold is at 170 watts. So right bang in the middle there, which is pretty interesting, right? But it's interesting, and it maybe gives some indications as to, oh, maybe my left leg needs a little more work. I had a hip injury on the left for quite a long time. So I'm wondering if that had any impact on vascular development, capillarization, and so on and so forth, which might lead to that discrepancy left to right. So it's an interesting insight, but it adds a level of difficulty, or you just have to know which leg you're measuring if you're using a Moxy on it continuously, and then you have to know what a normal quote unquote profile is for that leg. I think that's a second difficulty that comes with the data collection, is that you probably need, and that would probably be easy to acquire on someone who trains a lot and who measures every time. And then if somebody had the time to analyze the data after the fact, I think we could probably draw some interesting conclusions and potentially even set some training intensities of future sessions based on those data that were collected. I think that's just the difficulty now, and the barrier to entry is so much higher with the Moxy, not because it's hard to use, I don't think it is, but because there's so much information available on other methods to calculate intensity distribution, or to measure and then calculate or apply. There's so many methods already available that starting from scratch, quote unquote, with a new method using like a Moxy doesn't sound like a lot of fun. For some, it probably does. But yeah, collecting tens of thousands of data points and then spending hours analyzing them to then orient somebody's training, when you could just do a lactate test, when you could just measure critical power or calculate critical power, when you could just do an MLSS or such other such tests. I think what can yield some great advances in the use of the Moxy would be for people to start doing those tests in conjunction with one another. So when you do a lactate test, you measure muscle oximetry as well. When you do MLSS efforts, you measure muscle oximetry as well. And I would even suggest that for well trained athletes, at least that's what I've seen in my testing so far. For well trained athletes, there's a very interesting relationship between non-involved muscle oximetry and that second threshold, probably the metabolic one more than anything else, obviously. So there might be some correspondence there with lactate. There's a nice inverse relationship between, for example, absolute SMO2 value at the end of a 4 minutes step test and lactate values. And the oximetry came from the shoulder of a cyclist. So which makes sense if we think on first principles. But again, it doesn't always present exactly the same. And then I think another issue that I see that is not really talked about yet, at least not from what I've seen, but that is to consider pretty seriously, is the fact I feel like we're going to run into the same issue than we have with lactate currently, which is that there's 17 different methods to determine a threshold based on lactate values. And so how do you decide what the right method is? And it's not like there's as much now. There's obviously the discussion after this of saying, well, does it really matter that much if you were to use a log or a plus 0.5 over baseline or a this and that? Is it that much different from one another? At the end of the day, as long as you're conservative with those measures and you train underneath it when you're trying to accumulate time in zone 1 and 2, does it really make such a difference? I think obviously your testing method has to be consistent from one test to the next if you want to see some improvements, but the same problem can arise with SMO2, and I would say even to some orders of magnitude higher, because now we have so many data points because it's real time. You can get up to 2 hertz currently with the Moxy. So you have 2 data points per second. You could smooth that out, obviously. But still, like, what do you look at? Do you look at the minimum or maximum or the end step SMO2 value as a reference point? Do you take the average over the last minute? Do you take the average over the last 30 seconds? I think that would probably make the most sense, which is what I do when I look at absolute values. But then do you also look at the trends during the work interval? What do you make of the onset kinetics? Some people tend to drop really fast and then come up a little bit slower. Some people it's the other way around. So again, there's lots of problems that come from trying to interpret a metric that hasn't been used a lot and for which there isn't any very well established, let's say, guidelines. Even though, like I said, it's not like there's well established guidelines for, well, there are, but there's many different well established guidelines for many different metrics. I've talked a lot about problems. I don't know if I have many solutions, but I definitely think that one could use the Moxy on a daily basis. Like I said, I haven't collected enough data on a day-to-day basis to then be able to say, well, my normal range is within this, and then if I'm dehydrated, then it changes to that, or if I'm tired and I correlate that with my HRV, then it changes in such a fashion. We could probably infer a lot of things from what we can already measure and have measured for a long time, like lactate. I think that I definitely see a relationship between those parameters, but then what is the nature of that relationship? How solid is it across different people, across time for one person? So I think those are all interesting questions. I think to go a little further and maybe give a bit more answers than questions only, I find looking at the reoxy slope very interesting after a given effort. So the maximum slope of reoxygenation or resaturation seems to increase progressively up until you reach that second threshold. And then once you go over that, you don't have any further increase in positive slope after you stop the effort. So, which makes sense if we think about critical power as being highly correlated with capillary density of type 1 fibers and type 1 fiber proportion, and the fact that essentially you're going to be able to increase vasodilation up until that threshold, that fatigue threshold, above which you will no longer be able to increase your supply of oxygen to meet the needs of the muscles, and at which point you have quote unquote maximized that uh, vasodilation that you could generate. That's speculative, I guess, on my end. Still, I've seen some data go in line with this, um, but I believe it's still preliminary, and so I don't have anything solid on that. But I do definitely see some really interesting trends in there, and that's why I keep looking at the Moxy, because it's very interesting and insightful. And again, trying to understand the why and what's going on under the hood when somebody's performing a physical effort. But then obviously the rubber hits the road, and you have to think about, well, what's practical, what's actually applicable in the field with my athletes, because at the end of the day, most coaches only care about this, which is fair, which they should, which is what should all be aimed at, is making everyday training more structured, or at least have solid guidelines to work through in order to optimize training. But I think even with the current methods that we have available, we're a long shot from that. We're a long shot from understanding everything and how every type of training impacts the body and what is optimal and for whom and when. These are still all big questions that are, in most part, not fully answered. And so I see the Moxy as kind of just one more. It's not just one more, but it's one more metric that we have to worry about, quote unquote, or deal with, and it doesn't add any simplicity to the process. Although maybe it could. Although I believe that it probably could, given that it's a continuous measure, so that has its advantages over something that's invasive and more um, kind of plotted across time like lactate. Once we have the tech to analyze the data and interpret the data and have enough total data sets that we can see very significant trends emerge with different populations, with different training statuses. I think this is probably like big data is what comes to mind, and that's probably where we would get the most out of those tools is, well, and obviously that they wouldn't want to publish or share all that data, right? Probably not. I don't know. Just saying this, but I don't actually know what rules and regulations um, might impact this environment. But let's say like a pro cycling team, they decide for everybody to wear a Moxy at every single training session, and then they aggregate that data and they work through it. And depending on the intensity distribution, because we know all their physiological profiles, we know where their first lactate threshold is. They know where their either MLSS or critical power is, depending on what team is working with what model. So all those things could be correlated back with muscle oximetry, and then potentially be able to adjust things on a daily basis based on that metric. But again, then we come back to the simplicity that's needed to apply different concepts in the field. And do we want to? And I think that's an open question. Do we think that by measuring muscle oximetry daily, we can optimize training better than with what we're already doing, which is having HRV, having a readiness score, and having the power output on the bike that is telling you what's going on, or maybe your heart rate. If you have enough data at given power outputs, you know when your heart rate is depressed, you know where you probably need some more recovery. So all those things are all big questions that still need to be answered. So I'm sure I've been, asking more questions than giving answers, but I thought it was helpful, and I hope it gives a basis for future conversations. So leave me a comment below. Let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you in the next video.